When Mia Parker returns to the cockpit after a year away, she faces more than turbulence in the skies. Dismissed by a skeptical crew and passengers, she must prove her mettle when disaster strikes mid-flight. With a failing engine, a collapsed captain, and doubts clouding her every move, Mia's skills are pushed to the limit. Can she defy expectations and bring everyone to safety, or will her return end in tragedy? Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. Mia Parker tightened her grip on the handle of her roller suitcase as she walked toward the jet bridge. The faint smell of jet fuel and the muffled roar of departing flights filled the air. Her heart pounded, not from the excitement she used to feel but from the anticipation of what lay ahead. After a year-long leave to care for her father, she was returning to the cockpit. But instead of confidence, she felt the sting of self-doubt gnawing at her edges. She paused briefly before boarding, taking in the massive aircraft she would soon help pilot. The plane gleamed in the sunlight, a towering symbol of her childhood dream. Yet, as she approached, she caught a glimpse of the crew chatting just outside the gate. They hadn't noticed her yet. She recognized the senior flight attendant, Mr. Graham, instantly. His reputation as a stickler for tradition and an opinionated leader preceded him. As she stepped closer, Graham's sharp gaze landed on her. His brow furrowed almost imperceptibly, but enough for Mia to catch the flicker of skepticism in his expression. "You must be the new co-pilot," he said, his tone teetering on the edge of polite formality. "Yes, sir. Mia Parker." She extended a hand, which Graham shook briefly before turning back to the other attendants. "Well, let's hope you're ready for this. First flights back after a long break can be challenging," Graham said with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mia felt a flush creep up her neck. "I'm confident I can handle it," she replied, keeping her voice steady. As she boarded, she noticed some passengers glancing her way, their expressions curious. She wondered if they were judging her, just as Graham seemed to be. Her crisp uniform and confident stride should have been enough to command respect, but she could almost feel their unspoken questions. Is she experienced enough? Is she ready? Once inside the plane, Mia placed her bag in the cockpit and began her pre-flight checks. Her fingers moved methodically over the switches and levers, their familiar textures grounding her. The captain, a seasoned but affable pilot named Johnson, greeted her warmly. "Good to have you back, Parker. Let's make this a smooth one." Her confidence bolstered slightly by his kind words, Mia focused on her task. But just as she finished double-checking the systems, Graham entered the cockpit. His tone was casual, but his words cut deep. "Everything in order? I know this is your first flight in a while. If you need extra time or guidance, let me know." Mia's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "All set. Everything's ready." "Good," Graham said, lingering a moment longer before leaving. The first wave of turbulence hit during takeoff, barely noticeable but enough to make Mia glance at the weather report. The turbulence was forecasted to worsen mid-flight. She mentioned it to Captain Johnson, who nodded. "We'll manage," he said. As they climbed to cruising altitude, an alert sounded from one of the panels. "Minor issue with the landing gear sensor," Mia noted, her voice calm. She quickly suggested a workaround, but before she could finish, Graham's voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight deck, let's not alarm the passengers. We'll handle it on our end." Mia blinked. Was he interrupting me? She glanced at Johnson, who shrugged, clearly not wanting to make waves. Frustrated, Mia adjusted the settings herself, resolving the issue efficiently. Still, the incident left her rattled. Back in the cabin, Graham's dismissive attitude continued. "Let's hope we get through this without any hiccups," he muttered to another attendant, just loud enough for Mia to overhear as she stepped out for a quick break. The word stung. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Prove them wrong, she thought. You're here for a reason. As she returned to the cockpit, the captain suddenly clutched his chest. His face turned pale, and his breathing grew labored. "Captain!" Mia exclaimed, moving to steady him. Johnson shook his head weakly. I think it's my heart," he gasped. Panic surged through Mia, but she shoved it down, her training kicking in. She grabbed the intercom. "Medical emergency. I need assistance in the cockpit now." Graham arrived seconds later, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "What happened?" "The captain's incapacitated," Mia said firmly. "I'm taking control." "You're, what?" Graham's voice wavered, his skepticism evident. "I said, I'm taking control." Mia's voice was steady now, filled with the authority she had spent years earning. Graham hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Understood." Mia slid into the captain's seat and took the controls. The plane hummed beneath her, a mixture of power and responsibility. As turbulence rocked the cabin again, she tightened her grip and stared ahead. This flight just got a lot more complicated. Mia adjusted her headset, her hands steady on the controls. The cockpit felt heavier now, with Captain Johnson slumped in the co-pilot's chair and Graham standing behind her. She couldn't afford to falter, not with the turbulence rattling the plane and every pair of eyes relying on her to stay composed. "Medical personnel will be waiting at the airport," Graham reported after finishing a call to ground control. His tone, clipped and skeptical, grated on her nerves. "Good," Mia replied without looking back. "But right now, we need to stabilize the flight. This turbulence is worse than expected." The plane jolted again, and Graham gripped the back of her chair. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Mia didn't flinch. "I've got it," she said firmly, scanning the instrument panel. The intercom crackled, and a flight attendant's anxious voice filled the cockpit. "Passengers are starting to panic in the cabin. Can you make an announcement to calm them?" Graham jumped in before Mia could reply. "I'll handle it," he said, already reaching for the intercom. But Mia shot him a sharp look. "No," she said. "They need to hear from the pilot." She pressed the button and spoke clearly into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer, Mia Parker. We're currently experiencing turbulence, but I want to assure you that the situation is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your cooperation." As she released the button, Graham raised an eyebrow. "First officer?" he said with a smirk. Maybe they'd feel more reassured if the captain said something. Mia turned to face him for the first time since taking control. Her eyes were cold steel. "The captain isn't in a condition to speak. I am. If you have concerns, take them up with ground control when we land. Until then, let me do my job." For a moment, Graham looked like he might argue, but instead, he muttered, "Fine," and stepped out of the cockpit. Alone with the unconscious captain, Mia exhaled deeply, trying to push aside her frustration. She couldn't let Graham's doubts, or her own, cloud her focus. As the plane stabilized briefly, Mia used the reprieve to check the engine status. One indicator showed signs of wear in the left engine, likely a result of the turbulence. She ran a quick diagnostic and adjusted the throttle to balance the power output. "Mia," Graham's voice came through her headset, "we've got a passenger asking for more information. Should I tell them to wait until you've stabilized the flight?" "I'll come back with updates when I can," Mia replied curtly. She didn't have time to cater to individual anxieties, not when she was fighting to keep the aircraft steady. The reprieve didn't last long. Another wave of turbulence hit, this one stronger than before. The cockpit lights flickered momentarily, and warning alarms blared. "Engine 2 is losing power," Mia muttered under her breath. She tightened her grip on the controls. "Not now. Not now." She worked swiftly, diverting power from the auxiliary systems to the failing engine. The plane groaned in protest, but the engine sputtered back to life, its power output stabilizing. "That's it," she whispered, relief washing over her. But the alarms didn't stop. Ground control buzzed into her headset. "Flight 238, we're tracking your engine status. Prepare for the possibility of an emergency landing at your nearest airport. Weather conditions there are deteriorating." Mia's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to focus. "Understood, ground control. Preparing for emergency procedures." Graham re-entered the cockpit, his face pale. "What's going on?" "The left engine's compromised," Mia replied. "We're diverting to the nearest airport for an emergency landing." Graham hovered behind her, wringing his hands. "Are you sure about this? Maybe we should." Mia cut him off, her voice sharper than she intended. "I am sure. Now take your seat and let me work." Graham hesitated but finally complied, retreating to the cabin. The turbulence persisted, and Mia could hear faint murmurs of panic from the passengers through the thin cockpit door. Her thoughts raced. "You've trained for this. You've done it in simulators. You can do it now." But another voice crept in, whispering doubt. "What if Graham's right? What if they were wrong to trust you?" She glanced at the unconscious captain. "No time for doubts now." "Flight 238, ground control's voice came through again, prepare for a rough landing. Winds are hitting 20 knots. Be ready for crosswind adjustments." Mia swallowed hard. "Roger that." In the cabin, Graham finally addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some mechanical difficulties and will be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of the crew." Though his voice was calm, his face betrayed his unease. The passengers exchanged worried glances, clutching their armrests. In the cockpit, Mia ran through the landing checklist, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. She could feel the weight of every soul on board, their lives quite literally in her hands. The intercom crackled again. "First officer, are you sure about this?" Graham asked, his voice unsteady. Mia didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said firmly. "We're going to land safely." But in her heart, she knew the real test was only just beginning. The turbulence was relentless, each jolt shaking the cabin like a thunderstorm caught in a wind tunnel. Mia kept her grip firm on the controls, her knuckles pale against the dim glow of the cockpit instruments. The left engine sputtered again, and an alarm blared to life. She silenced it with a practice tap, but the message was clear, the engine's failure was imminent. "Ground control, this is Flight 238, Mia said, her voice level despite the chaos. "Requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing." "Copy that, Flight 238. You're cleared for runway 32 at Midland Regional. Winds at 25 knots, severe crosswinds expected. Advise further updates." "Understood," Mia replied, switching channels to address the crew. "Prepare for emergency landing procedures. Graham, I need the cabin secure. No delays." Graham's voice came over the intercom, tight with tension. "Passengers are already strapped in. We'll handle it." But even through the static, Mia could detect the hesitation in his tone. As the plane lurched again, the panel in front of Mia flickered, a critical diagnostic reading flashing red. The left engine was losing power faster than she anticipated. She adjusted the throttle, rerouting as much auxiliary energy as she could spare. It was a stopgap measure, barely enough to keep the plane stable for the descent. "Come on," she whispered under her breath, coaxing the failing engine to hold on just a little longer. Graham reappeared in the cockpit, his expression a mask of barely concealed panic. "Are we going to make it?" he asked, gripping the back of her chair as the plane shuddered. Mia glanced at him briefly, her focus never wavering from the controls. "We don't have a choice," she said. "I need you to trust me and stick to the procedures." Graham hesitated, then blurted, "Look, I'm just saying, maybe there's someone more experienced." Mia's patience snapped. "Someone more experienced than the person flying this plane right now?" she said, her voice cutting through the cockpit like a whip. "Sit down, strap in, and let me do my job." Graham recoiled slightly but nodded. He muttered something under his breath, then returned to the cabin. Mia let out a sharp exhale, refocusing on the task ahead. The descent began, and the plane groaned against the shifting winds. Ground control's voice crackled through the headset again. "Flight 238, we've got updated conditions. Gusts are now up to 30 knots. Advise caution on approach." "Roger that," Mia replied, adjusting the flaps to compensate for the crosswinds. Her training kicked in, muscle memory taking over as she guided the plane through the descent. The intercom buzzed. Graham's voice came through, hesitant and strained. "We've secured the cabin, but one of the emergency oxygen masks in the rear failed to deploy. Passengers are getting restless." Mia didn't hesitate. "Tell them we're almost there. Keep them calm." As she disconnected, her eyes darted back to the engine readout. The left engine's power dropped to critical levels, and the throttle control stuttered in her hands. The plane jolted violently, throwing Mia against her harness. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the cabin, followed by a muffled shout from the rear. "What was that?" Graham's voice came through, frantic. "Looks like something's dislodged in the cargo hold," Mia muttered, scanning the diagnostics. She tightened her grip on the controls. "Doesn't matter. We're almost there." But the alarms told a different story. Another warning lit up the console: hydraulic pressure was dropping, compromising the landing gear. Without it, the landing would be rough, if not catastrophic. Mia forced herself to breathe deeply, her mind racing. "Ground control, this is Flight 238, she said. "Hydraulics are compromised. Landing gear may not deploy fully." "Understood, 238. Emergency crews are standing by. Follow standard protocol." "Standard protocol." Mia almost laughed at the absurdity. There was nothing standard about this situation. Every instinct screamed at her to panic, but she buried the fear. There was no room for it now. As they approached the runway, Graham burst back into the cockpit, holding a piece of equipment. His face was pale. "This fell out of one of the storage bins during the turbulence," he stammered, holding up the damaged object. It was part of the emergency landing kit, a crucial tool for recalibrating the plane's hydraulics manually. Mia's stomach tightened. She grabbed the device and quickly assessed the damage. It was bent, but functional enough. "This should work," she said, already rerouting controls to the auxiliary panel. She worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced precision as the plane's descent continued. "Tell the crew to brace," she instructed Graham. "This landing is going to be rough." The runway loomed ahead, illuminated by a string of glowing lights cutting through the dark, turbulent night. Mia adjusted the throttle one final time, aligning the plane with the strip despite the brutal crosswinds. Her grip on the controls was ironclad. "Brace for landing," she announced over the intercom. The plane groaned as it descended, the wheels scraping the runway with a deafening roar. Sparks flew as the landing gear struggled to hold, but Mia kept the plane steady, guiding it with calculated precision. Finally, the plane came to a shuddering halt at the edge of the runway. Emergency vehicles rushed forward, their flashing lights painting the night in red and blue. In the cockpit, Mia slumped back against her seat, her chest heaving. She looked at Graham, who was staring at her with wide eyes, his disbelief slowly giving way to something else, something that looked like respect. "You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia didn't respond. She didn't need to. For the first time, she felt the weight of her doubt begin to lift. The moment the plane came to a halt, cheers and relieved sobs erupted from the passengers. Mia stayed frozen in her seat, gripping the controls as if the plane might still slip out of her grasp. Her breath came in shallow gulps, but she forced herself to focus. The cockpit, once filled with alarms and tension, was now eerily quiet, save for the hum of the aircraft systems winding down. "Mia," Graham said from behind her, his voice subdued. "The emergency crews are here. I'll start coordinating the evacuation." She glanced back at him, catching a flicker of unease in his expression. He seemed smaller now, his earlier bravado replaced by something akin to humility. She nodded curtly and returned her attention to the panel, ensuring every system was secure before shutting it down. As Graham exited the cockpit, Mia let out a shaky exhale. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but she didn't have time to process the enormity of what had just happened. The passengers and crew needed her to stay composed, to be their anchor in the aftermath of chaos. The evacuation process began smoothly. Passengers descended the emergency slides, guided by the crew and flanked by flashing red and blue lights from the awaiting emergency vehicles. Mia stayed in the cockpit a moment longer, double-checking the logs and ensuring the data recorder was intact. Every move felt deliberate, a way to keep her mind from spiraling. When she finally stepped into the cabin, she was met with an unexpected sight, passengers turning to her, their faces filled with gratitude. Some clapped, while others simply nodded in silent acknowledgement of her role in bringing them to safety. "Thank you, pilot," a woman whispered as she passed. "You saved my family." Mia managed a small smile, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her. Each thank you was like a stitch in the fabric of her confidence, slowly mending the tear caused by her own doubts and Graham's dismissiveness. Outside the plane, Graham was speaking to the emergency responders, his posture tense. As Mia approached, he turned, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might say something, but instead, he gestured toward the lead responder. "Lieutenant, this is First Officer Parker," Graham said. "She'll debrief you on the emergency procedures." The lieutenant nodded and extended a hand. "You did a hell of a job up there, officer." The winds alone could have grounded a lesser pilot. Mia shook his hand, murmuring a polite thanks. She felt Graham's gaze on her but ignored it, focusing instead on answering the lieutenant's questions about the engine failure and the hydraulic issues. Each word she spoke felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, a reminder of why she belonged in the cockpit. When the debrief ended, the passengers were being escorted to buses, and the once chaotic runway had begun to quiet down. Graham stood a few feet away, watching her. Finally, he took a step closer, his face a mixture of embarrassment and something else, something that looked like respect. "You did good, Parker," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Better than good. I was wrong about you." Mia met his gaze, her expression neutral. "You judged me before you even knew me," she said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for excuses. "You didn't think I could handle it." Graham's shoulders sagged slightly. "You're right. I let my assumptions get in the way. I'm sorry." Mia studied him for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Apology accepted. But remember, it's not about what you think someone looks like or how much experience you think they have. It's about how they act when it matters." Graham swallowed hard and nodded, looking chastened. "I'll remember." As the emergency teams wrapped up, Mia finally allowed herself a moment to sit. She leaned against the airport transport vehicle, staring at the plane that had carried her through the most harrowing experience of her career. The events of the flight replayed in her mind, the turbulence, the failing engine, Graham's resistance, and the moment she had taken control despite it all. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see her father's name on the screen. She hesitated before answering, her voice trembling slightly. "Hey, Dad." "I saw the news," his voice said, filled with pride and concern. "You okay?" Mia blinked back tears, a weight lifting off her shoulders as she heard the warmth in his tone. "Yeah. I'm okay. We made it." Her father chuckled softly. "I never doubted you for a second." The word settled over her like a bomb, soothing the cracks in her confidence. For the first time since stepping onto that plane, Mia let herself believe them. Mia stood in the dim light of the airport lounge, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her body ached from the tension of the last few hours, but her mind was racing, replaying every moment of the flight. The muted hum of conversation from passengers and crew surrounded her, but it felt distant, like static. She was still processing what had happened. A soft knock on the table pulled her from her thoughts. Graham stood there, looking uncertain. He held 2 steaming cups of coffee and offered one to her. "Truce," he said, his tone hesitant. Mia studied him for a moment, then nodded, accepting the cup. "Thanks." He sat across from her, fidgeting with the cup in his hands. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, his voice low. "You saved that plane. You saved all of us." "You're right," Mia replied evenly. "But an apology's a good start." Graham chuckled, though it sounded more like a sigh. "Fair enough. Look, I've been in this business for decades, and I've seen my share of pilots come and go. I thought I had a good read on people, but I let my bias cloud my judgment. I was wrong." Mia sipped her coffee, letting his words sink in. "You weren't just wrong about me," she said. "You were wrong about what makes a good pilot. It's not about appearances, or what you think someone's capable of. It's about what they do when it matters." Graham nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. And what you did today, it was remarkable. I mean that." The tension between them eased slightly, replaced by a tentative respect. Graham leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You know, your name sounded familiar when I saw the roster. Parker. Didn't think much of it until I saw how you handled yourself up there." Mia raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Your father. Was he Captain James Parker?" Mia blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah. How do you know him?" Graham let out a low laugh. "He trained me. Back when I was a junior attendant, still learning the ropes. Your dad was one of the best, always calm, always in control. He used to say, a good pilot isn't just someone who flies a plane, it's someone who earns the trust of every soul on board. I've carried that with me ever since." The weight of his words hit her, a flood of pride and emotion swelling in her chest. "He's the reason I became a pilot," she said softly. "I wanted to be like him." "Well," Graham said, meeting her eyes, "you're not just like him. You're better." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. The airline's operations manager strode into the lounge, his expression serious but tinged with relief. "First Officer Parker, Mr. Graham," he said, nodding at both of them. "I just finished reviewing the flight report. What you both endured today was extraordinary." Mia straightened, unsure of what was coming next. "Thank you, sir. We'll be conducting a full investigation into the mechanical issues, but let me say this, your actions today saved lives. The airline owes you a debt of gratitude." Graham stepped forward. "If I may, sir," he said, his voice steady. "It wasn't me. It was Parker. She took control when things went south. She made the decisions that got us here safely. The operations manager raised an eyebrow. Noted, he said, turning back to Mia. Expect formal recognition from the airline soon. We'll also be recommending you for commendation. Mia nodded, trying to suppress the wave of emotion rising in her chest. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. As the manager left, Graham lingered, his gaze thoughtful. Your dad would have been proud, he said quietly. Mia smiled, the words settling over her like a warm blanket. Thanks, Graham. Later, as Mia walked toward the waiting car that would take her home, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen before dialing her father's number. It rang twice before his familiar voice answered. Mia. I've been waiting to hear from you. I saw the news, are you okay? Her throat tightened, the weight of the day catching up to her. Yeah, Dad. I'm okay. We landed safely. I never doubted you, he said, his voice filled with pride. You handled it just like I taught you. Mia chuckled softly, blinking back tears. I don't know if I handled it like you would have, but I got us through. That's all that matters, he said warmly. You've always been strong, Mia. Today, you proved it to everyone. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to smile fully. Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without everything you taught me. As they talked, Mia felt the tension in her body finally start to ease. The doubts that had plagued her melted away, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had faced her fears, proved herself, and earned the respect of everyone on board, not least of all herself.